Section 18 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. Section 17. Exile of Time by Ray Cummins. Chapter 21. The Fight in the Powerhouse. I found the narrow aperture and stood peering down into the darkness. Miguel crowded behind me. The red beams of its eyes went down into the pit, and by their faint illumination I saw the heads of Larry and a girl swimming 20 feet below. The girl's dark hair floated out like black seaweed in the water. "The princess and the strange man!" exclaimed Miguel. I called, "Larry! Larry!" His laboured voice came up. "George! Thank God! Get us out of here! Almost gone, George!" I found my wits. "Then keep quiet, don't talk. Save your strength. I'll get you out." How? I could see that they were almost spent, for they were swimming with laboured, inefficient strokes, Larry using most of his strength to hold up the exhausted girl. We had not a moment to spare. I wildly contemplated tearing my garments to make a rope, but Miguel pushed me away. "I will bring them. Stand back." The robot had opened its metal side and drawn forth a flexible wire with a foot-long hook fastened to it. The wire came smoothly out as though unrolling from a drum. It leaned into the aperture and called down to Larry. "Fasten this around the princess. Be careful not to harm her. Put it under her arms." I saw that there was an eyelet on the wire, into which the hook could be inserted to make a loop. "Under her arms," Miguel called. "She will have to hold to the hook with her hands, or the wire will cut into her. Has she the strength?" Larry floundered as he adjusted the wire. Tina gasped, I have the strength." The robot braced itself, spreading its knees against the aperture, with its body leaning forward. "Ready?" it called. "Yes," came Larry's voice. Miguel's finger pressed a button at the base of its neck, and with the smooth power of machinery, the wire cable rolled into its side. Tina came up. Miguel gripped her and pulled her through the aperture, laid her gently on the catwalk. I unfastened the hook, and soon Miguel had Larry up with us. The robot stood aside with its work done, silently regarding us. I need not detail this reunion of Larry and me there on the spray-swept catwalk, clinging to the side of the great dam, with the foaming Hudson beneath us. Larry and Tina were not injured, and presently their strength partially returned. We hastily sketched what had happened to each of us. It was Tugh who was the guiding evil genius of all these disasters. Tugh, the Exile of Time, the ruthless murderer in many eras. He was here, very probably in the powerhouse, a few hundred feet away. And Tina, regarding the powerhouse, with her returning clarity of senses, saw that its sending signal lights were off, which meant that the air power of the New York district was not being supplied. Help from other cities could not arrive. Tina stood up waveringly. "We cannot stay here like this," she said. "Tugh has killed the guards and is there in control. The electrical defenses are shut off. They must be. The robots will soon be coming along the top of the dam, for their battery renewers are stored in the powerhouse. If they get them, this massacre will go on for days and spread all over. We've got to stop them. We must get in the powerhouse and capture Tugh." "But we have no weapons," Larry cried. "And he must have that white ray if he has killed the guards." "I have a weapon," I said. I had suddenly recalled the cylinder in my pocket. "I have a white ray." The desperate madness was on us all. The lives of thousands of people who might still be alive in Manhattan were at stake, and other millions would be massacred if these robots renewed their energy and spread the revolt into other cities. Over the roar and the wind lashing us, I shouted, "I promised Miguel I would kill Tugh. I will." I turned towards Miguel, but the robot had vanished. Afraid, no doubt, that we would want it to go with us after Tew, the terrified mechanism was hiding. We wasted no time searching for it. We had all been half hysterical for these few moments, but we steadied quickly enough as we approached the powerhouse's low entrance. The building was a rectangular structure, some 200 feet long. It was fastened upon great brackets to the perpendicular side of the dam and jutted out some 50 feet. It was 2 levels in height, a total of about 40 feet to its flat roof, in the centre of which was set a small oval tower. The whole structure was above us now. The catwalk went close underneath it, passing through an arch of the huge supporting brackets and terminating in a small lower platform with an open spiral staircase leading upwards some 10 feet into the lower story. The place seemed dark and deserted as we crept up to it. Gazing above me, I could see the top of the dam, now looming above the powerhouse. There was a break in the spillway at this point. The arching cascade of water under which the catwalk hung ended here. We came out where there was a vista of the lower Hudson beneath us, showing dimly down past the dock lights and skeleton landing stages to the bay. The sky was visible now, and the open wind struck us full. It was a crazy pendulum wind. The storm was breaking overhead. There were flares of lightning and thunder cracks from disturbed nature, outraged by the temperature changes of the robot's red and violet rays. The powerhouse, so far as we could see, was dark and deserted. Its normal lights were extinguished. Was Tew in there? It was my weapon against his. The white ray was new to Tina. We had no way of estimating this cylinder's effective range. The cylinder of the white ray which I carried was not the one with which Tew murdered Harl. Mine was portable and considerably smaller. I kept Tina and Larry well behind me. It was a desperate approach, and I was well aware of it. The catwalk now was illumined at intervals by the lightning. Tew, from many points of vantage in the powerhouse, could have seen us and exterminated us with a soundless flash swift as a lightning bolt itself. But we had to chance it. We reached the small lower platform. The catwalk terminated. The powerhouse was a roof over us. I stood at the front of the spiral staircase which went up through a rectangular opening in the floor. There was a vista of a dark room segment. "Keep behind me," I murmured, and I started up. Was Tew lurking here, waiting for me to raise myself above this opening? If he had been, he could have held his position against a score of assailants. But he was not. I soon stood breathlessly in a dark metal room. Tina and Larry came up. "He's not here," I whispered. It was more silent in here. The cascading water was further away from us now. There came a flash of lightning, followed in a few seconds by its accompanying thunder crash. I started. "What's that?" On the floor near us lay a gruesome, crumpled thing. I bent over it, waiting for another flash. When one came, I saw it was a heap of clothes, covering a white skeleton. By the garments, Tina knew it was one of the guards. We crept into a small interior corridor, where a small light was burning. The remains of 2 other guards lay here, close by the doorway as though they had come running at Tew's alarm, only to be struck down. It was horribly gruesome, here in the dimness with these bleached bones which had been living men so recently. And it was nerve-breaking to know that Tew was doubtless here somewhere. "Listen!" whispered Tina. There was a crackling sound overhead, and then the blurred murmur of a voice. An audible broadcasting transmitter was in operation. "It's in the tower," said Tina swiftly. "Tew must be there." This was an infinite relief. We went to the top story, passing, unheeding, another crumpled heap. Again we stood listening. The transmitter was hissing and spluttering, and then shouting its magnified human voice out into the night. It was Tew up there. He was calling audibly to his robots, with words which would he relayed upon all the local magnifiers in the city. Between the thunder cracks, we heard him plainly now. "This is your Master THUNDERBOLT in the powerhouse. Robots, we are triumphant. The city is isolated. No help can get in. Kill all humans, spare none. This night sees the end of human rule." And again, "When you want renewal, come along the top roadway of the dam. The electric defenses are off. You can come, and I have your renewers here. I have new batteries, new strength for you robots." THUNDERBOLT had been in the powerhouse before. He knew the operations of its various controls. He had come always by the surface route. He had heard of the existence of the secret tunnel, but had never before this night been able to find out where it was. "You stay here," I told Tina and Larry. "I'll go up there. I'll get him now once and for all." I reached the powerhouse roof. The storm tore at me. It was beginning to rain. I was near the outer edge of the roof, and 10 feet away stood the oval tower. I saw windows 20 feet up, with dim lights in them. Mingled with the storm was the hiss of the transmitter in the top of the tower, and the roar of THU's magnified voice. He had evidently been there only a brief time. From where I crouched on the roof, I could see overhead, along the top edge of the dam looming above me. The red robot rays were everywhere in the city, but none as yet showed along the dam's upper roadway. I got into the tower and mounted its small stairs. Creeping cautiously to the entrance of the control room, I saw a fairly large, dimly lighted oval apartment. Great banks of levers stood around it, tables of control apparatus, rows of dials, illumined by tiny lights like staring eyes. There was another gruesome heap of garments here on the floor. A grinning white skull leered at me. This was the main control room of the powerhouse. Across it, near an open window, THU sat with his back to me, bent over a table with the grid of a microphone before him. I raised my cylinder, then lowered it, for I had only a partial view of him. A huge transformer stood like a barrier between us. Noiselessly I stepped over the threshold, and to one side within the room. The place was a buzz and a hiss of sound, topped by THU's broadcast voice and the roar of the storm outside. Yet he was instantly aware of me. His voice in the microphone abruptly stopped. He rose, and with an incredibly swift motion, whirled and flung at me a heavy metal weight which had been lying on the table by his hand. The missile struck my outstretched weapon just as I was aiming it to fire, and the cylinder, undischarged, was knocked from my hand and went spinning across the floor several feet away from me. THU, like an uncoiling spring, still with one continuous motion, made a leap sideways to where his own weapon was lying on a bench, and I saw he would reach it before I could retrieve mine. I flung my heavy battery box, but missed him, and as I rushed at him, he caught up his cylinder and fired it full at me. But no flash came, only a click. He had exhausted its charge when he killed the powerhouse guards. With a curse, he flung it at my face, and my arm took its blow just as I struck him. We fell, gripping each other, and rolled on the floor. I was aware that Larry and Tina had followed me up. Larry shouted, "Look out for him, George!" I have described Larry's hand-to-hand encounter with the cripple. Mine was much the same. I was a child in his grip. But with his weapon useless and Larry rushing into the room, THU must have felt that for all his strength and fighting skill, he would have been worsted in this encounter. He blocked a jab of my fist, flung me headlong away, and sprang to his feet just as Larry leapt at him. I stood erect to see that he had sent Larry crashing to the floor. I heard his sardonic laugh as he hurled a metal stool at Tina, who was trying to throw something at him. Then, turning, he sprang through the open window casement and disappeared. It was 20 feet down to the roof. We reached the window to see THU picking himself up unhurt. Then, with his awkward gait, but at amazing speed, he ran across the roof to a small entrance in the face of the dam, where an interior staircase gave access to the roadway on top. He was escaping us. The electrical gate was open to him, It was only a few hundred feet along the damn roadway to that gate, and beyond it the roadway was open into the city, where now we could see the distant flashing lights of the robots advancing along the dam. Larry and I would rush to the roof to follow Tugh, but Tina checked us. She said, "No, he has too great a start. He's on top by now. And it's only a short distance to the gate. There's a better way here. I can electrify the gate again. Trap him inside." There was a similar gate and wall barrier at the Jersey entrance to the dam, and both gates operated them. The nearby Jersey section is still, an agricultural district, save for a few landing stages for the great airliners. The robots had spread into Jersey. But since few humans were there, with only robot agriculturalists working the section, the unimportant Jersey events have not figured in my narrative. Tina found the gate controls, but they would not operate. Those precious lost seconds, with Tugh running along the top of the dam and his robots advancing to join him. "Tina, hurry!" I cried. Larry and I bent anxiously over her, but the levers meant nothing to us. There were lost seconds while she desperately fumbled, and Larry pleaded, "Tina, dear, what's the matter?" "He must have ripped out a wire to make sure of getting away. I must find it. Everything seems all right." A minute gone. Surely Tugh would have reached the gates by now. Or worse, the robots would have come through and would assail us here. "Tina," pleaded Larry, "don't get excited. Take it calmly. You can find the trouble." I rushed to the window. I could see the upper half of the cross-wall gate barrier. It jutted above the top edge of the dam from the point of vision. On the Manhattan side, I saw the oncoming robot lights. And then, suddenly, I made out a light on this side of the barrier. It marked Tugh. It must have been a beam signal he was carrying. It moved slowly, retarded by distance, but it was almost to the gate, and then it reached there. "He's gone through!" I called. Then I saw him on the land side. He had escaped us and joined the robots. The light showed them all coming for the gate. And then Tina abruptly found the loosened wire. "I have it!" she exclaimed. She stood up, tugging with all her strength at the great switch lever. I saw, up there on the top of the dam, a surge of sparks as the current hissed into the wall barrier, saw the barrier glow a moment and then subside. And presently the lights of the balked robots, Tugh with them, retreated back into the wrecked and blood-stained city. "We did it!" exclaimed Larry. "We're impregnable here. Tina, now the air power, for help may be on its way. And then call some other city. Can you do that? They must have sent us help by now." In a moment the air power went on, and the city lighting system. Then Tina was at the great transmitter. She closed the circuits. London was frantically calling us. In the midst of the chaos of electrical sounds which now filled the control room came the audible voice of the London operator. "I could not get you because your circuit was broken," it said. "Our air vessel Migkrad, bearing the large projector of the robot Deranger, landed on the ocean surface 200 miles from New York Harbor. It was forced down when your district air power failed." Tina said hurriedly, "Our air power is on now. Is the Micrad coming?" "Wait. Hold connection. I will call them." And after a moment's pause the London voice came again. "The Micrad is aloft again, and should be over New York in 30 minutes. You're safe enough now." As the voice clicked off, Tina's emotions suddenly overcame her. "Safe enough? And our city red with human blood?" A wild thought abruptly swept me. Mary Atwood was back there in the cavern, alone, waiting for me to return. Subconsciously, in the rush of these tumultuous events, my mind had always been on her. She was secure enough, no doubt, locked in that room, but now Tugh was back in the city, and realizing that his cause was lost, he would return to her. I hastily told Larry and Tina. "But he cannot open the door to get into her," said Larry. But Miguel could open the door. Where was Miguel now? It set me shuddering. We decided to rush back to the underground route. The powerhouse could remain unattended for a time. We got down into the tunnel and made the trip without incident. We ran to the limit of Tina's strength, and then, for a distance, I carried her. We were all three panting and exhausted when we came to the corridors under the palace. I think I've never had so shuddering an experience as that trip. I tried to convince myself that nothing could have happened to Mary, that all this haste was unnecessary, but the wild thought persisted. Where was Miguel? A group of officials stood in one of the palace's lower corridors. As they came hastily up to Tina, I suddenly had a contempt for these men who governed a city in which neither they nor anyone else did any work. In this time of bloodshed, all these inmates of the palace had stayed safely within its walls, knowing that it was well fortified and that within a few hours help would doubtless come. "The Mikrat is coming with the long-range deranger," Tina told them briefly. After a moment they hastened away downstairs, and I heard one of them shouting, "The revolt is over! Within an hour we will have all the accursed robots inert! The Mikrat can sweep all the city with her ray!" The death of Alan, the guard in the tunnel to the robot cabin, had been discovered by the palace officials, and another guard was there now in his place. Miguel had not passed him, the guard told us. But there had been an interim when the gate was opened. Had Miguel returned here and gone back to Mary? We reached the cabin of machinery. It was dim and deserted as before. We came to the door of Mary's room. It was standing half open. Mary was gone! The couch was overturned, with its covering and pillows strewn about. The room showed every evidence of a desperate struggle. On the floor, the great 10-foot length of Miguel lay prone on its back. A small door port in its metal side was open. The panel hung awry on hinges half ripped away. From the aperture a coil and grid dangled half out in the midst of a tangled skein of wires. We bent over the robot. It was not quite inert. Within its metal shell there was a humming and a faint broken rasping. The staring eye sockets showed wavering beams of red. A grid of tiny wires back of the parted lips vibrated with a faint jangle. I bent lower. "Miguel, can you hear me?" I asked. Would it respond? My heart sent a fervent prayer that this mechanical thing, the product of man's inventive genius through 1,000 years, would have a last grasp of energy to answer my appeal. "Miguel, can you—" It spoke. "I hear you." They were thin, jangled tones, crackling and hissing with interference. "What happened, Miguel? Where is the girl?" I asked. "Tugh did this to me. He took the girl." "Where? Miguel, where did he take her? Do you know?" "Yes. I have it recorded that he said they were going to the time cage, overheard in the laboratory. He said he and the girl were leaving forever." End of chapter 21. Section 22 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. Chapter 22. The Chase to the End of the World. The giant mechanism, fashioned in the guise of a man, lay dying. Yet not that, for it never had had life. It lay deranged, out of order. Its intricate cycle was still operating, but faintly, laboriously, jangling, out of tune. Every moment its internal energy was lessening. It seemed to want to talk. The beams of its eyes rolled wildly. It said, "You did this to me. I came back here frightened because I knew that you was still controlling me. You hear me?" There was a muffled rumbling blur. Then its voice clicked on again. "When Tugh came, I opened the door to him, even though the girl tried to stop me, and I was humble before Tugh. But he was angry because I had released you. He deranged me. I tried to fight him, and he ripped open my side port. I thought the mechanism had gone inert. From within, it was complete silence. Larry murmured, "Good Lord, this is gruesome." Then the faint rasping voice started again. "Deranged me, and about you, he..." A blur. Then again, "You, he is, you, he is..." It went into a dull repetition of the three words, ending in a rumble which died into complete silence. The red radiance from the eye sockets faded and vanished. The thing we had called Miguel seemed gone. There was only this metal shell, cast to represent a giant human figure, lying here with its operating mechanisms out of order, smashed. I stood up. "That's the end of it. Mary Atwood's gone." "With Chew in the time cage," Larry exclaimed. "Tina, can't we..." "Follow them?" Tina interrupted. "Come on!" "No, you two wait here. I will go upstairs and verify if the time cage is gone." She came back in a moment. The laboratory overhead was fortunately deserted of robots. Larry and I had not thought of that. "The cage is gone!" Tina exclaimed. "Miguel told us the truth." We hastened back through the tunnel, past the guard, up into the palace and into the garden. My heart pounded in my throat for fear that Tina's time cage would have vanished, but it stood dimly glowing under the foliage where she had left it. A young man rushed up to us and said, "Princess Tina, look there!" A great row of coloured lights sailed slowly past overhead. The Mikrad was here, circling over the city. The storm had abated. It had rained only for a brief time. Crazy winds were subsiding. The Mikrad was using its deranging ray. We could hear the thrum of it. It sent out vibrations which threw the internal mechanisms of the robots out of adjustment, and they were dropping in their tracks all over the city. It was afterward found that many of the robots, heedless of the rain as they ran about the city intent upon their murderous work, had exploded by getting too wet. It chanced as momentarily we stood there at the entrance to the time cage while the great airliner swept by, that the top of the nearby laboratory was visible through the trees. We saw a white searchbeam from the Mikrad come down and disclosed a group of robots on the laboratory roof. Then the spreading beam of the deranging ray struck them, and they stood an instant transfixed, stricken, with wildly flailing arms. Then one toppled and fell. Then another. Two rushed together, locked in each other's grip, desperately fighting because of some crazy deranged thought impulse. They swayed and tore at each other until both wilted and sank inert. Another tottered with jerky steps to the edge of the roof and plunged headlong, crashing with a great metal clatter to the stone paving of the ground. The young man who had joined us dashed into the palace. We heard his shouts. "The revolt is over! The revolt is over!" This had been a massacre similar to Tew's vengeance upon the New York City of 1935, just as senseless. Both from the beginning were equally hopeless of ultimate success. Tew could not conquer this time world, so now he had left it, taking Mary Atwood with him. We hastened into the time cage. Larry and I braced ourselves for the shock as Tina slid the door closed and hurried to the controls. Within a moment we were flashing off into the great stream of time. "You think he has gone forward into the future?" Larry asked. "Won't the instrument show anything, Tina?" "No, no trace of him yet." We were passing 3000 AD, travelling into the future. Tina reasoned that Tew, according to Hull's confession, had originally come from a future time world. It seemed most probable that now he would return there. The time telespectroscope, so far, had shown us no evidence of the other cage. Tina kept the telescope barrel trained constantly on that other space 500 feet from us, which held Tew's vehicle. The flowing grey landscape off there gave no sign of our quarry, yet we knew we could not pass it without at least a brief flash of it in the telespectroscope and upon the image mirror. Nervously, breathlessly, we waited for a sign of the other time cage.
but nothing showed. We were not travelling fast. With Larry and Tina at the instrument table, I was left to stand at the window. Always I gazed eastward. That other little point of space, only 500 feet to the east, held Mary. She was there, but not now. She was remote, inaccessible. The thought of her with Chew, so inaccessible, set me shuddering. I was barely aware of the changing grey outlines of the city. I stared, praying for the fleeting glimpse of a spectral cage. I think that up to 3000 AD, New York remained much the same. And then, quite suddenly, in some vast storm or cataclysm, it was gone. I saw but a blurred chaos. This was near 4000 AD, and it was rebuilt, smaller, with more trees growing about, until presently there seemed only a forest. People, if they still were here, were building such transitory structures that I could not see them. 5000 AD. Mankind no doubt had reached its peak of civilization, paused at the summit, and now was in decadence, reverting to savagery. Perhaps in Europe the civilized peak lasted longer. This was a backward space during the ascent. Perhaps now it was reverting faster to the primitive. But I think that by 15,000 AD, mankind over all the earth had become primitive. There is no standing still. We must go forward, or back. Man, with his own machines softening him, enabling him to do nothing, eventually unfitted himself to cope with nature. The storm at 4000 AD in New York, for instance, even in my own time would have been merely an incentive to reconstruct upon a greater scale. But the men of 4000 AD could not do that. At the year 10,000 AD, with a seemingly primeval forest around us, Tina, Larry and I held an anxious consultation. We had anticipated that Chew would stop in his own time world. That might have been around 3000 or 4000, but we hardly thought, as we viewed the scene in passing, that it had come originally from beyond 4000. It was too civilized. Chew had not stopped. He had to be still ahead of us, so our course was to follow. Wherever he stopped, we would see him. If he turned back and flashed past us, that too would be evident. But if, from 2930, he had gone into the past, and then suddenly we glimpsed the other cage. It was ahead of us, travelling more slowly and retarding as though about to stop. A grey, unbroken forest was here. The time was about 12,000 AD. Tina saw it first through the little telescopic barrel. Then it showed on the mirror grid, a faint, ghostly barred shape, thin as gossamer. We even saw it presently through the window. It held its steady position, level with us, hanging solid amid the melting, changing grey outlines of the forest trees. They blurred it as they rose and fell. This chased through time. The two cages sped forward with the grey panorama whirling around them. Of all the scene, only that other cage, to us, was real. Yet it was the cages which were apparitions. We gathered at our eastward window to gaze across the void of that 500 feet. The interior of Chew's cage was not visible to us. A little window, a thinner patch in the lattices of the cage side, fronted us, but nothing showed in it. We were so helpless. Only 500 feet away, the Chew cage was there, now. Yet we could do nothing save hold our time-changing rate to conform with it. Of course, Chew saw us. He was making no effort to elude us, for neither cage was running at its maximum. For hours I stood gazing, praying that Mary might be safe, striving with futile fancy to guess what might be transpiring within that cage, speeding side by side with us in the blurred shadows of the corridors of time. And again, as so many times before, I was balked, guessing Chew's motives for his actions. He knew we could not assail him unless he stopped, but to what destination was he going? It was a chase, to our consciousness of the passing of time, which lasted several hours. Chew altered his time rate and sped more swiftly. My heart sank, for this showed he was not preparing to stop. We lost direct sight of the other cage several times as it drew ahead of us. but it was always visible on the image mirror. "I think," Tina said finally, "that we should stay behind it. When he retards to stop, we'll have a better opportunity of landing simultaneously with him." We passed 100,000 AD. The forest went down, and it seemed that only rocks were here. A barren vista was visible off to the river and the distant sea. The familiar conformations of the sea and the land were changed. There was a different shoreline. It was nearer at hand now, and it was creeping closer. I stared at the blurred grey surface of water, at the wide undulating stretch of rock. We came to 1,000,000 AD, a million years into my future. Ice came briefly and vanished again, but there were no trees springing into life on this barren landscape. I could not fancy that even the transitory habitations of humans were here in this cold desolation. Were we headed for the end? I could envisage a dying world, its internal fires cooling. 10 million years, then 100 million. The grey scene, blended of dark nights and sunshine days, began changing its monochrome. There were fleeting, alternating intervals now, when it was darker, and then lighter with a tinge of red. The Earth's rotation was slowing down. Through thousands of centuries the change had been proceeding, but only now could I see the lengthening days and nights. Perhaps now the day was a month long, and the night the same. 1 billion years! 1 billion AD! By now the day and the year were of equal length, and it chanced that this western hemisphere faced the sun. I could see the sun now, motionless above the horizon. The scene was dull red. The sun painted the rocks and the sullen sea with blood. A shout from Larry whirled me round. "George! Good God!" He was bending over the image mirror. Tina, ghastly pale, with utter horror stamped upon her face, sprang for the controls. On the mirror I caught a fleeting glimpse of Hugh's cage, wrecked and broken, and instantly gone. "It stopped!" Larry shouted. "Good God, it stopped all at once! It was wrecked! Smashed!" We reeled. I all but lost consciousness with the shock of our own abrupt retarding. Our cage stopped and turned back. Tina located the wreckage and stopped again. We slid the door open. The outer air was deadly cold. The sun was a huge dull red ball hanging in the haze of a grey sky. The rocks were grey-black, the blood light of the sun upon them. 500 feet from us, by the shore of an oily sullen sea, the wreckage of Hugh's cage was piled in a heap. Near it, the crumpled white figure of Mary lay on the rocks. And beside her, still with his black cloak around him, crouched Hugh. End of chapter 22.
Section 20 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931.
Chapter 23. Diabolical Exile of Time. Hugh saw us as we stood in our cage doorway. His thick, barrel-like figure rose erect, and from his parted cloak his arms waved with a wild gesture of defiance and triumph. He was clearly outlined in the red sunlight against the surface of the sea behind. We saw in one of his hands a ray cylinder. And then his arm came down, and he fired at us. It was the white disintegrating ray. We were stricken by surprise, and stood for that moment transfixed in our doorway. Hugh's narrow, intensely white beam leapt over the intervening rocks, but it fell short of us. I saw that it had a range of about 100 feet. Over the muffled, heavy silence of the blood-red day, the cripple's curse floated clear. He lowered his weapon, and heedless that we also might be armed, he leapt nimbly past Mary's prostrate form and came shambling over the rocks, directly for me. It stung me into action, and for all the chaotic rush of these desperate moments, My heart surged with relief. Mary was not dead. Beyond Hugh's oncoming figure, as he shambled like an infuriated charging bear over the rough rocky ground, I saw the white form of Mary move. She was striving to sit up. I held my ray cylinder, the one I had rescued from Miguel, but its range was no more than 20 feet. I had tested it, and Hugh's beam had flashed a full 100. I whirled on Larry. "Get away from here, you and Tina, you can't help me." "George, listen!" "He's coming. Larry, you damn fool, get away from here. It goes 100 feet, that ray of his. It'll be raking us in a minute. Run, I tell you. Get to that line of rocks." Close behind our cage was a small broken ridge of rocks, strewn boulders in a tumbled line some 10 or 15 feet in height. It would afford shelter. There were broken places to give passage through it. The ridge curved crescent-shaped behind our cage and ran down towards the shore. Larry and Tina stood white and confused. Larry panted. "But George, I can help you fight him. Hide here in the cage." "Get away, I tell you. It's his death or mine this time. I'll get him if I can." I shoved Larry violently away and ducked back into our doorway. Only a few breathless seconds had passed. Hugh was still several hundred feet away from us. Larry and Tina ran behind the cage, darted between the boulders of the ridge, and vanished. I crouched in the cage. Hugh was not visible from here. A moment passed. Dared I remain? If I could get Hugh within 20 feet of me, my shot was as good as his. The silence was horrible. Was he coming forward? Did he know where I was in here? I thought surely he must have seen Larry and Tina run away and me dart in here. We had all been in plain sight of him. This horrible silence. Was he creeping up on me? Would he fire through the doorway or appear abruptly at the window? I could not tell where to place myself in the room, and it could mean my life or death. The silence was split by Tina calling. "Hugh, we've caught you!" Her voice was to one side and behind our cage, calling defiance at Hugh to distract his attention from me. Through the window I saw the flash of his beam slanting sideways at Tina. I gauged the source of his ray to be still some distance off and crept to the door, cautiously peering. Hugh stood on the open rock surface. He had swung to my right and was near the little ridge of rocks where it turned and bent down to the shore. Behind me came Tina's voice again. "At last we have you, Hugh!" I saw Tina poised on the top of the ridge, partially behind me at the elbow of the ridge curve. She screamed her defiance, and again Hugh fired at her. The beam slanted over me, but still was short. Larry had vanished. Then I saw him, though Hugh did not. He had run along behind the ridge, and appeared now well down towards the shore. He was barely 100 feet from the cripple. I saw him stoop, seize a chunk of rock, and throw it. The missile bounded and passed close to Hugh. Larry instantly ducked back out of sight. The bounding stone startled Hugh. He whirled toward it and fired over the ridge. Tina again had changed her position and was shouting at him. They were trying to exhaust his cylinder charges, and if they could do that, he would be helpless before me. For a moment he stood as though confused. As he turned to gaze after Tina, Larry flung another rock, but this time Hugh did not fire. He started back towards where, by the wreckage of his cage, Mary was now sitting up in a daze. Then he changed his mind, whirled, and fired directly at my doorway. I was just beyond the effective range of his beam, but it was truly aimed. I felt the horrible, nauseous impact of it, a shuddering, indescribable sickening of all my being. I staggered back into the room and recovered my strength. A side window port was open. I leapt through it and landed upon the rocks with the cage between Hugh and me. He fired again at the doorway. Tina had disappeared. Larry was now out of range, standing on the ridge, shouting and hurling rocks. But Hugh did not heed him. He was shambling for my doorway. He would pass within 20 feet of me as I crouched outside the cage at his opposite corner. I could take him by surprise. And then he saw me. He was less than 100 feet away. He changed his direction and fired again, full at me. But I had had enough warning, and, as the beam struck the cage corner, I ran back along the outer wall of the cage and appeared at the other corner. Tew came still closer, his weapon pointed downward as he ran, 50 feet away. Not close enough! I think, there at the last, that Tew was wholly confused. Larry had come much closer. He was shouting, and from a ridge behind me, Tina was shouting. Tew ran, not for where I was lurking now, but for the corner where a moment before he had seen me. Now he was 30 feet from me. 20. Then nearer than that. Wholly without caution he came forward. I leaned around the edge of the cage and fired. In one breathless instant the voices of Tina and Larry abruptly hushed. My beam struck Tew in the chest. It caught him and clung to him, bathing him in its spreading intense white glare. He stopped in his tracks, stood transfixed for one breathless, horrible instant. He was so close that I could see the stupid surprise on his hideous features. His wide slit of mouth gaped with astonishment. My beam clung to him, but he did not fall. He stood astonished, then turned and came at me. For just a moment I was stricken helpless there before him. What manner of man was this? He did not fall. My ray, which had decomposed the body of Allen, the guard, had left his skeleton stripped and bleached in an instant, did not harm Tew. He had walked into it, taken it full, and he did not fall. He was still alive. I came to my senses and saw that Larry, seeing my danger, had run into the open, dangerously close, and hurled a rock. It struck Tew upon the shoulder and deflected his aim, so that his flash went over me. I saw Tew whirl toward Larry, and I rushed forward, ripping loose the cylinder of the ray projector from its restraining battery cord. In the instant the cripple was turned halfway from me, I landed upon him, and with all my strength brought the point of the small heavy cylinder down on his skull. There was a strange splintering crack and a wild eerie scream from his voice. He fell with me on top of him. Crowning horror! Tew lay motionless, twisted half on his back, his thick arms outstretched on the rocks, and his weapon still clutched in his hand. Culminating, gruesome horror! I rose from his body and stood shuddering. Amazing realization! The bulging, misshapen head was splintered open, and from it, strewn over the rocks, were tiny, intricate cogs and wheels, coils and broken wires. It was not a man, but a robot. A super robot from some unknown era, running amok. A mechanism so cleverly fashioned by the genius of man that it stood diabolically upon the threshold of humanity. A super-mechanical exile of time, but its wild irrational career of destruction through the ages now was over. It lay inert, smashed and broken at my feet. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The Return. I think there is little I should add. Tew's last purpose had been to hurl himself and Mary past the lifetime of our world, wrecking the cage and flinging them into eternity together. And Tew was luring our cave and us to the same fate. But Mary, to save us, had watched her opportunity, seized the main control lever, and demolished the vehicle by its instantaneous stopping. We left the shell of Tew lying there in the red sunlight of the empty, dying world, and returned to Tina's palace. We found that the revolt was over. The city, with help arrived, was striving to emerge from the bloody chaos. Larry and Tina decided to remain permanently in her time. They would take us back, but the cage was too diabolical to keep in existence. "I shall send it forward unoccupied," said Tina. "Flash it into eternity, where Tew tried to go." Accompanied by Larry, she carried Mary and me to 1935. With Mary's father, her only relative, dead, she yielded to my urging. We arrived in October 1935. My New York, like Tina's victim of the Exile of Time, was rapidly being reconstructed. It was night when we stopped, and the familiar outlines of Packing Place were around us. We stood at the cage doorway. "Goodbye," I said to Larry and Tina. "Good luck to both of you." The girls kissed each other, Such strangely contrasting types. Over 1,000 years was between them, yet how alike they were, fundamentally, both just girls. Larry gripped my hand. In times of emotion, one is sometimes inarticulate. "Goodbye, George," he said. We've already said all there is to say, haven't we?" There were tears in both the girls' eyes. We four had been so close. We had been through so much together. And now we were parting forever. All four of us were stricken with surprise at how it affected us. We stood gazing at one another. "No!" I burst out. "I haven't said all there is to say. Don't you destroy that cage. You come back. Guard it as carefully as you can, and come back. Land here, next year in October. Say, night of the 15th. Will you? We'll be waiting." "Yes," Tina abruptly agreed. We stood watching them as they slid the door closed. The cage for a moment stood quiescent. Then it began faintly humming. It glowed, faded to a spectre, and was gone. Mary and I turned away in the New York City of 1935 to begin our life together. End of Exile of Time by Ray Cummins.
Section 21 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by michelekilpatrick. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. Section 21. To the Moon. The prediction that man will fly to the moon within the next 100 years was made by John Q. Stewart, Associate Professor of Astronomical Physics at Princeton University, in a recent address at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. The first obstacle to be overcome is that of developing a speed of 25,000 miles an hour, the professor said, which means production of fuels more powerful than coal, gasoline, dynamite, or any other source of energy now available. Such remarkable progress has been made in the speed of passenger-carrying vehicles in the last century that scientists believe that a speed of 1,000 miles per hour will be reached in 1950, and 50,000 an hour will be surpassed before the year 2030, a century from now. The one theoretically feasible method of making the journey to the moon, Stewart believes, is a vehicle propelled on the principle of the rocket. He visions a ship built in the form of a large metal sphere, 110 feet in diameter, weighing 70,000 metric tons, and carrying a crew of 60 and a dozen scientists. A dozen or more cannon would protrude slightly from the surface, shooting material at the rate of 200 miles a second. A half hour or so before noon, and about 3 days before a new moon, Stewart would head his ship toward the sun, expecting it to rise 12 miles in the first 6 minutes and to soar out of the Earth's atmosphere at 200 miles per hour. 2 hours and 29 minutes after the takeoff, the firing from the lower cannon would be stopped, with the ship going upward, the professor estimates, at 190 miles per minute and having reached a height of 13,200 miles. 70 hours later, crossing the moon's orbit, Stewart would fire the forward cannon and the ship would coast around the moon, becoming the temporary satellite of a satellite. The rest would be easy, said Stewart, owing to the lesser gravity of the moon. The cannon would be fired to cushion the fall to the moon as the ship was gradually sucked toward the satellite. The moon is airless, waterless, and lifeless. Days and nights are 2 weeks long. Temperatures range from that of boiling water at noon, down perhaps to that of liquid air at midnight. The men of the ship would walk on the moon clad in diving suits. Gravity being only 1/6 that of the Earth, a man would carry several hundred pounds of apparatus for providing air and for regulating the temperature. To leave the moon, the ship would fire her rear cannon and coast back to Earth. By firing its forward cannon, it would cushion its landing on the Earth, which would have to be made on a desert because of the tremendous charges the cannon would fire. End of section 21. Recording by michelekilpatrick.
Section 22 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931, Section 22. The Reader's Corner, a meeting place for readers of Astounding Stories. Part 1. The author explains. Dear Editor, I'm very much puzzled by the several apparent mistakes in two of the stories in the April issue of Astounding Stories. In The World Between the Moon, Mr. Ernst makes an error so obvious that it almost makes me believe that it isn't an error. Like doing a math problem and finding it so easy that you're sure you have done it wrong. Anyway, here's my problem. This is taken verbatim from the story. At 2,000 miles from the Earth, there still had been enough hydrogen traces in the ether to give purchase to the explosions of their water motor. Does the author mean to say that the explosions of the tubes have to have something to push against to have any action? A. Has it not been proven actually and mathematically that the explosion of rockets and expanding gases are even more powerful in space? The spaceship in this story was equipped with both bow and stern tubes. Why not fire them to slow the ship down instead of waiting to run into some resistance? B. Also, when they landed, they took some air guns which shot bullets containing a liquid which exploded when heated by the passage of a shell through the barrel. Then the author goes ahead and tells us that the planet was about as hot as the tropics. Such heat would explode the bullets, but it didn't. Why? Mr. Ernst has his heroes do a lot of running around on that little planet. C. Since the planet is smaller than the moon, it hasn't much gravity and therefore can't retain a very heavy atmosphere, or one very thick. Anyone doing all that violent exercise would probably die of exhaustion before many minutes of it. 4 Miles Within was a good story, but I am unable to understand why they did not find a lot of stagnant air. Air that had lain stagnant for the time that the cavern must have been closed would have killed the person who breathed it. Also, I would imagine that it wouldn't be safe to handle a chunk of radium like the characters in the story did. It's liable to burn. However, it probably wasn't pure radium, just pitchblende-bearing rocks. The rest of the stories were fine. I especially like the story of the Special Patrol Service, which S.P. Wright has created. Let's have some more stories of Commander John Hanson and his crew. The Exile of Time has started off quite well, and I look forward to the next installments. Cummins is always good for a batch of thrills and some swell adventure, to say nothing of the enjoyable way he introduces science into his stories. Wish you would publish this, as I would like to get in touch with some other science fiction fans. By the way, some of the readers seem to want the mag changed, but don't you do a thing to it. All the suggestions, if followed, would make our mag like the other SF mags on the market. And I read Astounding Stories because it's different, and I mean every one of those capitals. Ben Smith, Box 444, Billings, Montana. Mr. Ernst answers. A. No, it has not been actually proved. It has been indicated mathematically, by formulae based on conjecture, but never actually solved, for the very good reason that it is impossible to reproduce spatial conditions in earthly laboratories. Know how an explosive force would react in space? We don't even know positively what space is, let alone how our chemicals and instruments would behave in it. The majority theory is that explosives charge would propel a rocket or spaceship more effectively in the theoretical emptiness of space than in our atmosphere. But to my mind, it is quite possible that an explosion, a violent expansion of gases causing rapid increase of pressures, would be ineffectual where there are no pressures to be increased. Might not the violently expanding gases fly forth from an exhaust vent to expand instantly, frictionlessly and impotently, to the ends of the universe? In my story, The World Behind the Moon, I assumed that it would occur, and no man living is in a position positively to disprove it. And as a corollary, if a propulsion explosion cannot have effect in empty space, as presumed in the story, the spaceship must enter atmosphere before it can stop by firing its bow tubes. Otherwise, when the bow tubes shooting their expanding gases futilely into nothingness, you could go into reverse till the cows come home, and the ship would hurtle forward just the same. B. Friction of a bullet through a rifle barrel produces a temperature considerably higher than tropical. C. Again, no one knows spatial or planetary conditions. It seems reasonable to assume that a planet's mass must have a fairly direct bearing on the density of its atmosphere, However, Venus, a smaller globe than Earth, is supposed to have a denser atmosphere. For all we know, to the contrary, meteors no larger than pebbles may carry about with them microscopic films of atmospheres of varying densities. Paul Ernst. Hitting Our Stride. Dear Editor, the more I read Astounding Stories, the more I like it. You're just getting your stride the second year. But why not foresee the demand of your readers and have a few stories by R.F. Starzl? You have other top-notchers, such as Ray Cummins, Murray Leinster, and Tom Curry is another good writer. Monsters of Mars would have been better if it were boiled down to about 2/3 as many pages. It reads stretched. W.P. O'Toole, Parker, South Dakota. This Missile. Dear Editor, congratulations! Our magazine, is going over big. However, there are a few things I would like to suggest. First, why not take a vote on the Quarterly idea? Second, give us more stories and illustrations. Increase the price if you have to, but keep up the good work and I'm your steady buyer. So far I have not missed a copy, and my only regret is that I didn't have sense enough to keep the first 6 or 7 instead of throwing them away. By the way, didn't I notice a rather heated argument going on in the Reader's Corner about reprints? And what is the matter with reprints? Nothing, except that they are reprints. That is hardly an argument. But if you value my monthly 20 cents, please give us at least one reprint to a volume, which I see comprises 3 copies of our magazine. If the rest of the readers acquiesce, I think we ought to have a reprint in the near future. If they object, well, the world will roll on. Your time is precious, and besides, there are more readers waiting to say the same things I have just said. So I will close this missive. Eugene Benefiel, The Pioneer, Tucson, Arizona. From the Antipodes. Dear Editor, as a regular reader of your magazine, Astounding Stories, I thought I would write and tell you how I appreciate the stories contained in it. I am a heavy reader and have always had a soft spot for stories unusual and bizarre. Until I happened to see your magazine at a bookshop in Perth, I had to be content with occasional science fiction stories by Wells, Burroughs, and a few others, which I picked up in my browsing in various bookshops and libraries. Now that I get Astounding Stories regularly, I have a monthly feast of good things that I read and reread until the next issue arrives. You ask us readers to criticize the magazine. Well, I have no complaints worth mentioning, except that some of the illustrations do not tally sufficiently with the text of the story. Some of the stories, in my opinion, are weak and not worth reading, but as tastes differ, I take everything as it is, and say you have a first-class publication. Will you thank your authors for me for the very many hours of interesting reading that they have given me during the past 12 months? Later I intend to get my Astounding Stories bound in cloth covers, each 12-month issue in a volume. If any reader sees this letter, of course should you think it worthwhile to publish it, and can spare the time to write to me here in Australia, I would be very grateful. Perhaps we could exchange snapshots of various places of interest. Every part of America interests me, so a reader need not back out because he thinks his district will be not interesting enough. Here's hoping Astounding Stories grows and prospers as the years go by, so as to give more entertainment to me and my fellow readers. A rather selfish wish, you may think, but you will forgive me when I say that I look forward with great pleasure to each month's issue. Claude J. Nanley, 65 Forest Street, Mount Lawley, Western Australia. Note to Ray Cummins. Dear Editor, I have just started Ray Cummins' latest story in the April issue. Although I wish Cummins would lay off this type of story, I am willing to read anything by him. Jack Williamson's The Lake of Light ranked second in this issue. He is another merit. The Ghost World by S.P. Wright came third. Edmund Hamilton was better than he has been of late. If anyone wants to read Through the Dragon Glass, The Girl in the Golden Atom, etc., and writes to me, I will tell him where they can be obtained. This is not an attempt at free advertising. I know several places where it is possible to secure works of this kind, and will be glad to assist anyone who doesn't. Cummins brought me to your magazine. He is keeping me there, so hold on to him. But please tell him to forget all about time and probe the mysteries of the infinitely large and small, of interplanetary space, of future civilizations, and future warfare. Dale Mullen, 611 West 5th, Topeka, Kansas. The Effects of Cannabis. Dear Editor, I have sold magazines, written for magazines, and now that I have just concluded your April issue, I am editing one for myself. Specifically one story, 4 Miles Within. Inside a radium mine? Chased by a amoeboid body? Aho! Several years ago, when I was a clinical chemist in hospital service, there went a genologist, also a young chap, and a surgical nurse, and myself were so badly burned with 3 grains of the substance enclosed in a lead capsule that we were crippled for nearly a month. No fair, your experience was pure radium. It was only radium ore in the story. Imagine being 4 miles inside the earth exposed to radium ore. And chased and pursued by a giant amoeba? Aho! That must have been my pet mother of a vinegar that escaped. She was hard to herd. She took after my dad's pet fish, which fell through a crack in a bridge and was drowned. In passing, it is interesting to note that persons can vanish into a plane surface, say into a 5th dimension. My instructor in trig must have been all wet. And Dr. Bird catches a man withdrawing menthium from human brains with a needle, without the use of either X-ray or trephine? And then low forms of life such as crabs and alligators with very highly developed scientific knowledge? A few issues ago, octopi were in the lead. And those spaceships. Mars must be an interesting spot. And those Martians. Sometimes they are ant-like and other times worms, and again human freaks. I still prefer the silver-green messenger I saw on the stage 20 years ago. He was a gentleman and a scholar, and no one has yet improved upon him. And those radio waves that can vibrate matter in a straight line? One Jackson Gee vibrates it in 2 straight lines. Rather funny at that. And people disappear into an atom by taking pellets? They take the pellets into their system and that shrinks or expands them. How does the author calculate that in Beyond the Vanishing Point? The pellets must contain cannabis indica, hashish, I guess. Once upon a time, I was suffering from an acute attack of colic and was obliged to use an antispasmodic. I took cannabis, and in the delirium that followed, I shrunk small enough to walk into a mouse hole into which I had seen a mouse disappear a few hours previous. The mouse was there and looked like an elephant. I awoke in a sweat. Maybe all your stories won't be weird and full of monstrosities. Science is full of beauty and culture, you know. Arthur H. Carrington, Seaside Heights Pharmacy, Seaside Heights, New Jersey. Like some to seem real. Dear Editor, I've been reading Astounding Stories since the November issue, and I think that, on the whole, it is a very good magazine. It is of handy size, convenient price, and okay, except that you might cut the edges of the pages smoother. Wesso is an excellent artist. I think your best authors are Harl Vincent, Ray Cummins, and Captain S.P. Meek. I like Captain Meek's Dr. Bird stories immensely. Also among your best authors are Charles W. Diffin and Murray Leinster. And now about the stories themselves. I've noticed that quite a few in the Reader's Corners are all for fiction and no scientific explanation. I like fiction too, but anybody can make up a pretty good plot about a girl, a lover, and a villain, and have a wild theory of super science for a basis, and then not explain it. What I like most is when an author who uses such theory as, for instance, making matter invisible by bathing it with a ray the color of which is beyond the range of the spectrum, as in Terrors Unseen, by Harl Vincent, backs up his idea with a clear explanation, and makes it plausible and convincing. It makes his tale seem more possible, and hence more real. I like it much better when the writer doesn't even suggest a theory in his plot, to say nothing of trying to prove it, than when he gives you the invention of a professor in the year 2431, and lets you imagine how and why it works. T. Caldwell, 912 Moreno Road, Santa Barbara, California. Heroes Too Heroic? Dear Editor, I wrote you a letter last month, I'm writing you a letter this month, and I will write you a letter next month. In fact, I'm going to write you a letter every month just as soon as I finish the latest issue of Astounding Stories. So you might as well have a special department installed in Astounding Stories right away entitled Letters from the Sap Who Thinks He Is So Smart, or something else equally appropriate. Have you ever noticed that 99% of Edmund Hamilton's stories have the same plot as Monsters of Mars? The plot I mean is this. A group of men, preferably 3, get into enemy territory. As to the enemy, if the enemy are not lizards or some other repulsive form of life, Mr. Hamilton has them wear repulsive clothes, live in ugly buildings, etc., to make the reader dislike them at the start. An old idea, and quite a commonly used one, is to have these creatures about to declare war and conquer the hero's country with the enemy's superweapons, and after capturing our brave, bold, and heroic heroes, proceed to tell the heroes the way the weapons work, the 0 hour set for attack, and the line of march of the enemy's armies, as if prisoners are told all these things. Our heroes then cleverly escape and grab an enemy machine. About 2,000 of the enemies close in to kill them, but Mr. Hamilton simply loves buts. Our brave heroes glance over the strange controls of the captured craft and without hesitation pick out the right levers and hold the enemy at bay. After annihilating most of them, and after the 0 hour has come, the heroes prevent the great invasion and return to their native land. It is interesting to note that heroes, though greatly outnumbered and with strange weapons, always down many of the enemy while they themselves escape unscathed. Also, Mr. Hamilton loves narrow escapes, and phrases such as these appear frequently in his stories. But even as he raised his deadly ray tube, I leaped and knocked it from his hand. They charged, but I was too quick, and dodged as the foremost hurtled at me. These incidents are supposed to get the reader all excited, but after a while they grow monotonous. The second story in the April issue, The Exile of Time, promises to be excellent in every way. It would be interesting if George Rankin, in his time traveling, should witness the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the Battle of Bunker Hill. 4 Miles Within was good also, save that the heroes escaped from being marooned, and James Quaid's death savored unpleasantly of Edmund Hamilton. Sewell Peaslee Wright's adventures of the Space Patrol are always fascinating, and The Ghost World is a splendid example of this. On the whole, your magazine is practically perfect. Robert Baldwin, 359 Hazel Avenue, Highland Park, Illinois. Likes them to seem real. Dear Editor, I've been reading Astounding Stories since the November issue, and I think that, on the whole, it is a very good magazine. It is of handy size, convenient price, and okay, except that you might cut the edges of the pages smoother. Wesso is an excellent artist. I think your best authors are Harl Vincent, Ray Cummins, and Captain S.P. Meek. I like Captain Meek's Dr. Bird stories immensely. Also among your best authors are Charles W. Diffin and Murray Leinster, and now about the stories themselves. I've noticed that quite a few in the Reader's Corners are all for fiction with no scientific explanation. I like fiction too, but anybody can make up a pretty good plot about a girl, a lover, and a villain, and a wild theory of superscience for a basis and then not explain it. What I like most is when an author who uses such a theory as, for instance, making matter invisible by bathing it with a ray the color of which is beyond the range of the spectrum, as in Terrors Unseen, by Harl Vincent, backs up his idea with a clear explanation and makes it plausible and convincing. It makes his tale seem more possible and hence more real. I like it much better when the writer doesn't even suggest a theory in his plot, to say nothing of trying to prove it. Then when he gives you the invention of a professor in the year 2431 and lets you imagine how and why it works. T. Caldwell, 912 Merino Street, Santa Barbara, California. End of section 22. Section 23 of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 19, July 1931. Section 23. The Reader's Corner, a meeting place for readers of Astounding Stories, Part 2. Covers too imaginative? Dear Editor, for crying out loud, why can't everyone be satisfied? One person says our magazine is too small. Another says it's okay. One wants so-and-so's work, someone else doesn't, etc. Why can't readers be reasonable? They'll continually admit AS is the best science fiction magazine on the market, with which I thoroughly agree, and then they'll start complaining, as if anything can be 100% perfect, though AS comes awfully near it. Then for some of the complaints, I recall but 2 sensible ones. I have read every issue of AS except for the first 2, and several times I have been tempted to write you about them. 1. Too imaginative a cover gives the narrow-minded non-science fiction reader an idea that our magazine contains trash. I refer to such covers as those on August, September, October 1930 issues, and in the March, April, and especially May 1931 issues. These people's opinions reflect rather harshly on the faithful AS readers. Can't the covers be more like those on March, May, June, and July 1930 issues? All those stories themselves, however, were great as usual. 2. Please hold down on the Reader's Corner. Isn't an 8 and 9 page section a bit too much? A short story had been suggested. Good idea. Why not limit it to a maximum of, say, 5 pages? I shall not complain of any of the stories because I realize that others probably enjoyed what very few I may not have. I must, however, say that Ray Cummins' Brigands of the Moon holds first place in my opinion. It was great. Please keep up the excellent work. Meredith L. Evans, 4001 Cedar Lane, Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. Evenly Divided. Dear Editor, although I missed the first few issues of Astounding Stories due to the fact that I was not aware of its publication, I have become a regular reader. In glancing through your Reader's Corner, I became aware of the fact that most of the letters therein praise Astounding Stories to the skies and put it far ahead of any other science fiction magazine. I will not go so far, as it is my belief that most magazines of this type are on the same level. In fact, it seems absurd to me to state otherwise, as the authors who write for you one month publish stories in another magazine the next month. Of course, these authors put out, once in a while, stories that are much better than their usual offering, but taken over a fairly long period of time, these periodic occurrences will be about evenly divided amongst various magazines. I have the conceit to believe that I know what I am talking about, as my observations are based on 5 years of science fiction reading. Of course, while I believe that there are other magazines equally as good, Astounding Stories is certainly not inferior to any. There is always room for science fiction magazine of the same caliber as Astounding Stories, but unfortunately for the public, there are too few of them. James M. Kennedy, Ithaca, New York. Machine or Beast? Dear Editor, having read about every issue of Astounding Stories to date, I have decided that it is the best of the 3 science fiction magazines that I have read. The best story that you have published yet, in my opinion, is Brigands of the Moon by Ray Cummins. Sewell Peaslee Wright and Victor Rousseau are also very good writers. The only 2 stories that I did not like were Murder Madness and The Marauder. The former belonged in a detective magazine, and the latter in the wastebasket. It was too far-fetched for even my imagination. Now, a word about your cover illustrations. The first issue that I bought convinced me that your artist was a genius, but my opinion of him is steadily decreasing. That illustration that I speak of was a scene from Brigands of the Moon. It certainly was good. Lately, I am ashamed to show the magazine to my friends because of the gaudily painted and repugnant creatures on the cover. A picture of a machine is much more appropriate than a beast of some kind. Wesso seems to be able to draw a picture like that which is on the March or April 1930 numbers better than those of late. I would like to communicate with the science fiction readers about my age, which is 15. I will answer any or all letters that are written to me. William D. Crocker, Ashfield, Massachusetts. Expert Opinion. Dear Editor, may I express my pleasure and gratification in your worthy magazine. I read 2 other science fiction publications besides yours, but Astounding Stories is by far their superior, especially as there is a human interest to your stories that is sadly lacking in the others. They also contain too much technical detail. Your magazine is just right. The paper is easy on the eyes and the type is distinct and doesn't blur or tire the eyes. The color illustrations leave nothing to be desired. The edges, size, number of pages, etc. are of no concern to me. I have read every issue of Astounding Stories since it was published, and can find no fault with it whatever. If those soreheads who howl incessantly about the minor details would only try to get out a paper of their own, they would soon see what a wonderful work you were doing. The May 1931 issue, which I have just finished, is really the best collection of science fiction stories I have read in many a day, and I have read quite a bit. I wish you every success in the world. C.P. Binsford, M.D., of 604 Pearl Street, Huntsville, Alabama. A satirical drama, complete. Dear Editor, 1-act play of the future. Time traveler from the 20th century. So this is the year 24,000 A.D. Sulsul-D9. Yes, visitor from the past. Time traveler. Say, Sulsul-D9, has Astounding Stories brought out a quarterly yet? Sulsul-D9. No, man from long ago, but it looks like we will have one within the next 5 years. Forrest J. Ackerman, 530 Staples Avenue, San Francisco, California. An employment non-solution. Dear Editor, Owing to the fact that I have been a constant reader of Astounding Stories since the first day it appeared on the newsstands, I think that it is about time for me to drop a few lines to you to show my appreciation for the many, many good stories that you have given the readers of science fiction in the pages of your magazine. I agree very strongly with Mr. Sager of Bensmer, Alabama, about the paper in the book. If the stories are interesting, why in the name of the 7 kinds of Hades should anyone worry about the kind of paper as long as the print is readable? What is that old saying about the best articles not being always in the best wrapped parcels? I am here to say that Astounding Stories is the best of its kind. What I have to say now is by no means a criticism. I am merely asking for an explanation. I have no regards for those people who are continually looking for flaws to peck about in various stories. In the May 1931 issue, my choice of all the fine stories was Dark Moon. That was a super story, and I enjoyed it from start to finish, even the 3rd or 4th time I read it. If a story is worth reading once, it is worth reading several times, is my belief. But now comes the question. Will some other kind reader endeavor to explain it to me? How could the intrepid explorers of Dark Moon see the light of Earth and other planets if the light from the Dark Moon could not pass the gaseous formation to Earth, etc.? And how could the Dark Moon receive the light that it did? Mr. Diffin did not explain that. Perhaps he intends to do so in a sequel. Who knows? One main fault I find with Astounding Stories is that it is not published twice a month, if not oftener. Wait, would that not be a plan to help out unemployment? It would put more men to work, and I am sure that all of us readers could scrape up 20 cents more a month for this wonderful magazine. How about it? But this, I think, would increase unemployment. I would like to hear from some of the readers in the near future. Best wishes for the continued prosperity of the magazine. Kristen G. Davis, 531 South Millard, Chicago, Illinois. Doggone if he didn't. Dear Editor, the stories being the most important part of the magazine come first. Dark Moon by Charles W. Diffin is the best novelette you have yet published, and that's saying a lot for it, isn't it? Next comes The Exile of Time by Ray Cummins, another impossible time-traveling story, but nevertheless interesting. Welcome to Astounding Stories, Mr. SCHACHNER and Mr. ZAGAT. Your story, The Death Cloud, was great. I hope you'll favor us with another story soon. And if here isn't Captain Meek, with another Dr. Bird story. Captain Meek, if you stop writing them, I'll never read another of your marvelous stories. The moon turned green, and I'll be doggone if Hal K. Wells didn't go and write a nice little story telling us all about it. That was nice of you, Mr. Wells. I enjoyed it very, very much. Now let's take a look at the cover. Mr. Wesso, you certainly have a marvelous imagination. You are an excellent cover artist. It isn't everyone that can illustrate science fiction stories. I do wish that you will illustrate science fiction stories only, as that is where you are at your best. Almost any artist can illustrate detective story magazines, so don't waste your talent on them. Ha! Here we are at the In the Next Issue page. Hurrah, hurrah! Arthur J. Burks is back again. Can't you manage to get next month's issue out a little earlier, Mr. Bates? R.F. Starzl's also back again. And there's another story by Charles W. Diffin. Isn't this a grand old world? I will close with this suggestion. Let's have more illustrations, at least 2 for each installment of the serials and 2 for each long novelette. Make the extra illustrations full-page ones. Jack Darrow, 4225 North Spalding Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. And amusing. Dear Editor, I have just finished the May issue of A.S., and I want to tell you that Dark Moon by Charles W. Diffin was fine. Let's have more stories like that. Your The Reader's Corner sure is interesting and amusing. I like to read letters from readers. A bouquet. A.S. is a really fine magazine. I think it is one of the best of its kind. Of course it can be improved, but what can't? There's no sense in criticizing a magazine as some readers do. I think if the editor could make his magazine any better, he would do it without hesitation. Charles Strata, 503 Olive Street, Kansas City, Montana. Cummings and Wagner. Dear Editor, Astounding Stories is in my estimation the best magazine on the market. Words are feeble when an accurate description of the pleasure that I receive from every issue of Astounding Stories is needed. However, I will say that next to my extreme appreciation of classical music, I rate Astounding Stories as being the best outlet of my emotions. As in the music of the great German composer Richard Wagner, whom I rate as the greatest of all composers, so do I find an outlet of my emotions by reading a novelette by Cummings, Vincent, Leinster, and many other of your excellent authors. For example, I shall take the overture to the Flying Dutchman. In the beginning of this overture we hear the opening call, played by the trombones with string section accompanying this principal motive with wild crescendo. This excites the brain so that a taste of supreme motives is like an appetizer at dinner. So taking the novel Ray Cummins entitled Beyond the Vanishing Point, we find that in the opening paragraphs there is also an appetizer to the rest of the story which is to follow. Now returning to our Flying Dutchman overture, we find that after the introduction by the wild calls, by the trombones and the string accompaniment, we gradually drift into somewhat pensive mood. So in the story, for the next few pages, we find more or less quiet reading. Gradually, however, this quiet mood in the music gives way to rolls on the kettle drums, announcing a grand climax. Finally, the music becomes wilder and wilder until at last the storm breaks, and we actually picture this ghost ship riding over the waves in a terrific storm. Lightning flashes, thunder roars, huge waves sweep over the deck of the ship as we see the Dutchman at the wheel laughing out his defiance and diabolical fury. And so in the story we are finally led up to the grand climax, which actually grips anyone with an ounce of red blood in his veins. And now I would like to ask the following questions. Is there some reader of Astounding Stories who no longer has any use for the old issues of Astounding Stories, and would be so kind as to send me these? From the first issue up to November 1930 issue, and also the December 1930 issue are the magazines that I should like to have. Leave your magazine as is. Only have one good long novelette, not two fairly good ones as in your April issue, which was not up to the standard set by your previous magazines. Walter J. Deal, 14538 8th Avenue, Malba, New York. This time-traveling traffic. Dear Editor, many times during the past months while reading your really remarkable magazine, I have come across contradictions and explanations throughout the stories, which, while not very serious, tend to give me the impression that the authors either did not care about nor did not see through the errors they committed. I did not complain about them, considering them but minor mistakes. But in Ray Cummins' last current novel, The Exile of Time, there exists such a monstrosity as I believe calls for an explanation. Mr. Cummins' story, you know, centers around his time-traveling machine. If such a thing were possible, would it not be reasonable to believe that a holder of the secret of time-traveling could go back into the past and prevent some catastrophe or tragedy as his historical knowledge of the event would make possible? According to this theory, then, a person could go back into the past and divert the hand of Wilkes Booth on April 15, 1865, about to assassinate Lincoln. But this shows its own impossibilities, that of two contradicting absolute truths for the world to believe. Likewise, a person could travel into the future, learn of his own death, go back into his own time, and take measures to prevent it. In the same way, this could not be, but Mr. Cummins explains that these things are impossible. I do not mean to be critical, but it would lend much more interest to the story if the authors would be a bit more careful. Robert W. Conrad, Rush City, Minnesota. Tripe? Dear Editor, in the short time your magazine has been out, it has already established itself as the best in its field. I got a real kick out of most of your stories. In the May issue, 2 yarns are outstanding. Charles W. Diffin's splendid Dark Moon, and Nat SCHACHNER and Arthur L. Zagat's especially fine The Death Cloud. These 2 are as thrilling of stories as I have ever read. Mr. Diffin I have read before and always enjoy, but Messrs. SCHACHNER and Zagat are new to me. I am looking forward to seeing more of their stuff. But what has happened to Cummins? He used to be aces up, but now comes this tripe of his called The Exile of Time, especially the current installment with the long-winded rot about mysticism and theosophy and the Lord knows what. Where was the editor when this blew in? Surely there are plenty of Swami sheets for that truck. It has no place in Astounding Stories. Give us more Diffin, Leinster, SCHACHNER, Zagat, and Rousseau, and you'll keep us all satisfied. D.K., Standish Arms, Brooklyn, New York. For Rocket Fans. Dear Editor, it may interest your readers to know that the American Interplanetary Society has just completed its first year of existence, and looks forward to a most energetic second year in pursuing its aims. The Society has practically completed the first lap of its research on the possibilities and limitations of the rocket, and intends to continue this research for another year before publishing a complete report, which shall be the first extensive survey of the rocket in English. We plan also to extend the size and scope of our monthly bulletin to make it of a real magazine that shall publish all of the news, both of America and abroad, dealing with the developments in astronautics and rocketry. It will also contain the reports of the Society's members on the rocket, as well as some interesting general articles on the various phases of interplanetary travel. Plans are also maturing for a campaign of mutual experimentation on the rocket, which we shall be ready to carry out before the end of the year. The Society is also completing plans for the formation of an international interplanetary commission, which shall coordinate the work of the national science societies and plan to solve the problems of astronautics on a worldwide basis. While the growth of the Society during the past year was very promising, we hope to extend during this year the scope and field of our activities and membership. We have members now in 36 states in Canada, Mexico, France, and Russia. To your readers, we offer our active and associate memberships, giving to lovers of science fiction a chance to assist in the bringing to realization the dream of all interplanetary travel. Information about the Society and the classes of membership can be attained by writing to the Secretary at the address below. Nathan SCHACHNER, Sect American Interplanetary Society, 113 West 42nd Street, New York City. The Reader's Corner. All readers are extended a sincere and cordial invitation to come over in the Reader's Corner and join in our monthly discussion of stories, authors, scientific principles, and possibilities. Everything that's of common interest in connection with our astounding stories. Although from time to time the editor may make a comment or so, this is a department primarily for readers, and we want to make full use of it. Likes, dislikes, criticisms, explanations, roses, brickbats, suggestions, everything's welcome here, so come over in the Reader's Corner and discuss it with all of us. The Editor. End of the Reader's Corner, a meeting place for readers of astounding stories. Part 2. End of Section 23. End of Astounding Stories 19, July 1931, by Ray Cummins.